I think even from that little clip in less than ideal conditions, we can see the power and strength of that film, which is around about 30 minutes long.
It's 30 minutes long, yeah. And I'm sorry, the design of the images, the moments where Natasha, my actress, is speaking to camera, as it were absolutely designed to be resonant of a Dutch interior portrait from around the 1600s, which is why you have this, very dense sort of palette that unfortunately can't be picked up when the curtains are open. But I hope, at least, as you've said, from the narration and the sound, that you get a sense of what the work is.
Perhaps I should just explain as well that there are some images behind us that neither of us can see, and we're not going to talk individually to any of those images, but they're a selection of images which are installation shots from the two recent shows, work of Sutapa's from the 1980s, and items from your archive that Sutapa's kindly put together as just a kind of visual background to our conversation. But if at any point we want to refer to anything particular there, we can. But one of the things that I think is really evident just from that short clip is how important history is in your work. Art history, but also history in a much wider sense. But history also that's located in very personal experience and autobiographical experience. The film focuses very much on your mother and her experience. And it was quite interesting. I noticed only this week, re-looking at the catalogue for the show, the issue of painting, which Alice briefly mentioned Sutapa was part of, together with Margaret Harrison and Glenys Johnson in 1986. And I noticed that the opening section of the catalogue is dedicated to your mother. And it seemed a really poignant link between work that you're making now, 40 years later, and work that you were making then as a very young artist. As Alice said, you were in Thin Black Line when you'd just graduated, and this show was just the following year. So I wonder if you maybe wanted to talk a little bit about the interconnection of art making and history in a very broad sense, and art history and personal history.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think for me, because I was born in India, and because my parents were born, and my grandparents, forefathers, were born prior to partition in what was British India, effectively. And the consequences of partition that forced them to leave their place of birth, which was British India, then became East Pakistan, now is Bangladesh. This history of displacement, and then the subsequent displacement of my parents and myself, consequently, in post-partition India, because of the complexity of the political and social circumstances, which really made it impossible for my father to stay in India because of his disagreements and his differences with the Indian Congress at the time, in a very volatile period post-partition, means that it's been hard for me as an individual not to think about life and to frame it in a wider context that is absolutely underlined by economic, social, political, and historical sort of circumstances. And so for me, I think growing up as a child, those were the kinds of conversations that I absolutely remember having at the dinner table, with my father, rarely, I have to say, with my mother, because I think she found the whole transition very traumatic. But I think that those are the things that always framed my own life and my own perspective. And interestingly, I think I've probably been trying to make Lumen for the whole of my life, actually, because one of my earliest recollections, and in many senses this was the prompt, I think, to making Lumen, but certainly to my sort of moving towards art as a profession, was my memory of my mother. I must have been about the age of 5, wearing a blue sari, stood in front of a window, and with a light pouring in. She had her back 3/4 away, I suppose, and she was reading letters from home on what at that time was often used, aerograms to read these things from home. And it wasn't, I think it was just after she was weeping, and she wasn't aware that I was watching her. But then when I came into contact soon after, probably at the library or a Reader's Digest manual or something, with Vermeer's painting, it really stuck with me because of this very poignant moment of having witnessed my mother go through this experience. And so when I then, some 14 years later, was an undergraduate student at the University of Leeds, which as a department, as most of you will know, is where T.J. Clarke had established a highly sort of theoretically underpinned course that brought practice and theory together and very much engaged and embedded with a kind of socio-historical reading of art practice and art history. I began to look at Vermeer's painting again and to deconstruct the symbolism within that painting, which of course is made, I think, around 1659 or 63, around the time of the expansion of the Dutch colonial empire. And this was also the time of around which, there was established a Dutch East India Company. And so I began to look back to that particular period in history, the late 1600s, during the Tudor times, which was precisely the time that the Crown, Elizabeth I, sanctioned the free market economy and trade, which in many senses was a polite word for, or polite description of a sort of piracy, because it was very much based on a very brutal and violent system. And so the Dutch East India Company was then, I think David Olusoga very recently described it as, being hijacked by the British East India Company, who were an absolutely mercenary organization, highly militarized. And of course, tracing Vermeer's painting and tracing that moment of witnessing my mother was something that I think was really critical for me to understand my own journey through this other journey.
I think it's really interesting in that sense that you chose for your first degree Leeds University as a place to go, where you could not only study fine art but study art history, and it's evident that had a real impact on you right from the beginning. It's interesting as well that you're talking about painting in the context of, just to bring it back to the issue of painting show. one of the things that struck me about that show was just how young you were. And it's something that in the history of Rochdale shows during the 80s has struck me more than once. And it's something that a lot of artists that I've spoken to over the last couple of years have said, you know, about how the opportunity that young artists were given in a gallery like this to have, so, you know, Jill and Sarah and Bev and her other colleagues were going to degree shows, looking at student work, and not afraid to show people at the very beginning of their careers, and often with catalogues, you know, to graduate and have a show in a significant institutional, albeit regional gallery, and to have a catalogue, you know, as almost the first show you had. I know you were in Thin Black Line even before that. But, you know, those kind of opportunities, it seems to me, were quite extraordinary at that time. And it must have been quite an experience for you. I mean, because the other two artists in the issue of painting, Margaret Harrison and Gladys Johnson, were of an older generation. And it's interesting as well, actually, the issue of painting, that in one sense, I don't really think of any of the three of you as painters. And so there's a whole, I mean, Glenys, I guess, is the closest to that, but Glenys has made a lot of print work. Margaret's worked in all kinds of media. You've worked in all kinds of media, especially film and video. And so that whole idea of the issue of painting seems like it's quite a multi-layered title, actually, because it clearly refers to what was at that time often referred to as issues-based art. In other words, making art that had some kind of engagement with social and political ideas rather than abstraction and pure aesthetics. But it's also, listening to what you're saying about Vermeer, it's also about the issue of the history of painting and how that might or might not inform what artists are doing at that time.
I mean, I have to say that part of my degree show, in fact, was, and Housewives with Steak Knives was part of my degree show, as was Carly, which is now in Tate's collection. And I made Carly between 1983 and 1985. So, in fact, I was about 19. So, in fact, I was about 19 when I started making that work. But, I mean, there are a number of things that you've said there, so maybe I could just catch it as I go, which is to say that I have to own up to the fact that, you know, I didn't go to foundation school. I was doing science I did my art A-level age 16, and I was studying the sciences. And I managed to persuade my parents that, you know, I wanted to be an artist. They encouraged me to go to a university, an art school within a university context. And I went to Leeds, I have to confess, not because TJ Clark was there, but because I was a fan of the Gang of Four.
That's a good reason to go to Leeds, in my view. Yeah.
You know, and I just thought it must be a really interesting place because this is interesting. And so that was my prompt. And then, of course...
you found not just the Gang of Four, but Griselda Pollock and Fred Horton and Tim Clark.
Well, that was even more interesting, actually. Well, I shouldn't say that because I still know some of those people, but it was just amazing because I hadn't anticipated that this extraordinary course would embrace these connections between, you know, social, historic, kind of economic and political readings of art practice. So it was absolutely the right place for me, and I think I flourished there because it just seemed to sit very squarely with the kinds of conversations that I was having already at home, really, about understanding life in a more broad sense. In terms of the issue of painting, you know, as I say, in terms of my final degree show and the work I was making, as an undergraduate student, it was mixed media always. But I think that one of the things that Juliet Stein actually writes about along the lines of resistance, which I've got here, that I co-curated
I was going to move on to
with Claire Slattery and Sarah Jane Edge, was, I think Juliet Stein's essay is very interesting because she talks about the context of this exhibition, how, you know, the idea was, at that particular time in history, feminist practice or feminist art was very much more affiliated with scripto-visual practice, in other words, text-based things. And I was making photography pieces that were photographs and text, but I think that part of the reason that I was very keen to, and still am, to use painting and drawing as a form of art was because I was very aware of the accessibility, questions around the accessibility of language and connecting to what was placed in front of you. How did one read into it? And I think that that is very interesting in the context and the history of what Rochdale Art Gallery was about. And was,
I think it's also interesting in the sense that one of the things that Rochdale enabled you to do was curate as well. And you know, having said you were given an extraordinary opportunity at a very early age to be in a show like The Issue of Painting, it's only a couple of years later that you were curating an exhibition in a gallery like this, not a gallery like this. And I think that along the lines of resistance is another one of those shows that kind of illustrates all kinds of things about things that we're kind of talking about this morning. Because it's, I mean, for people, and I guess lots of people won't have been familiar with that show, but as Alice said earlier, it was initiated at the Cooper Gallery in Barnsley, another very small local gallery in the north, and there's a connection of leads, I think, between you and Sarah and Claire, who were the three people who curated that show. But I've got the list of artists in that group show here. Simone Alexander, Sonia Boyce, Shyla Kamari Berman, Sally Dawson, Xenia Dimitriou, Nina Edge, Catherine Ensel, Tricia Ferguson, Rachel Field, Leslie Hakim Dowek, Mona Hatoum, Labina Hamid, Rosamund Kinsey Miller, Monica Ross, Leslie Sanderson, Veronica Slater, Marlene Smith, Anne Talentire, and Lois Williams. I mean, that is an extraordinary list of artists, some of whom have since become extremely established and well known, some of whom have disappeared from view. But the idea that a show like that, with that range of artists in it, curated by three young people, because again, you were the youngest, I'm sure, of that three, but Sarah Jane Edge and Claire Slattery weren't that much older than you. And the three very young, just out of university, or I think in Claire's case, still studying at this, or I think she was doing maybe a PhD at that time, I can't remember, but you know, very young people curating artists like that in galleries in the north. And when I said that when I lived in the middle of nowhere, Rochdale was the place I went to, when I was going to Rochdale and the Corner House and the Bluecoat, I didn't think I was missing anything by not going as far as London. And you know, I think it's really interesting that all those things were happening through a network of connections here, and you know, that included Leeds in a different way as a place where you and Sarah and others were educated.
We were very feisty young women, yes.
You were.
I like to think I'm still feisty.
I was just about to say that. Took the words right out of my mouth. Well, you were acknowledged as such by Griselda Pollock. I have, talking about the Leeds connection, I have a quote here from Griselda, who was talking about you as a student And she said it was Sutapa Biswas who forced all of us to acknowledge the Eurocentric limits of the discourses within which we practice. That's quite something to be said by a tutor at university about a young artist.
It's entirely true.
I wouldn't suggest for a moment otherwise.
I did challenge her, and I think that, when I arrived at Leeds, and it's Claire and Sarah Jane Edge were both postgraduate students, and I think one of the unique things about the University of Leeds, the Fine Art Department and Fine Art and Art History Department at the time, was that, and it really was unique. They only took about 12 students a year, and so we were quite spoiled in some senses. But we would have shared seminar sessions with PhD and master's students. And, I think I was just quite fearless, but also because it was a very immersive sort of context within which to think about art and practice and art history in the context of wider issues. And even though at that time it was such a radical course, nevertheless, quite frankly, any discourse around colonial history and imperialism was absolutely missing from the curriculum. And it was very difficult for me to, be so excited about being somewhere like that, and so exposed to these kinds of discourses, and yet, be looking at one of the first images I saw projected on an absolutely massive cinematic scale was Turner's Slave Ship. And, Tony Hughes, who was the art historian giving the lecture, such a lovely man, talked about it in terms of the palette and all kinds of things, but nothing was being said about what was in the water and how it got in the water, how the slaves, what were the bodies, where had they come from? And it just sort of set alarm bells really for me. And I remember saying to Griselda and to my other tutors, why are we not talking about the history of imperialism? Why are we not talking about what's in the water and how it got there? And it is true, I did demand Griselda change the course. She thinks I said a week, but I think I gave her maybe 2. But anyway, I just said it has to be done immediately. So,
but that clearly very much informed the ideas behind along the lines of resistance, which, one of the interesting things about going through that list of the artists who were in it is the diversity of places that they came from, the diversity of areas of resistance that their work was engaged with. There are Irish artists there, there's a Palestinian artist there, so it's that thing that you're describing was very much there for you as an undergraduate student, fed into your curating of that show, which again, fits very much into the history of what was happening here in the 80s, obviously later in the 80s when Lubana Hamid and Lord Salter were working here too. It was an agenda that was very much being developed.
Well, I think you couldn't disconnect it from the wider political issues of that time,
absolutely.
Which is to say that, in post-war, Second World War Britain, Britain was coming to terms with its demise as an empire force, and what we were seeing, in the 70s and 80s was an extraordinary time, a hugely difficult time, following Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. And in 1981, as I was, about to come to Leeds, that was a year of riots up and down the country. race riots.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
so,
in various ways, I think, other things that people are going to talk about today will cover that, but that will cover aspects of that. But that is another important part of the history of what was happening at Rochdale in the 80s, was that it was regularly showing work and artists who were engaged in the many political struggles of the 80s that you and I remember very well.
well, they were all connected.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
and it goes back to this question of capitalism, doesn't it?
Of course.
And how, empire, the whole premise of empire building is based on racial capitalism,
Yeah.
and questions around class and other questions, really. And
Sure.
so, because of that kind of dialogue that had been initiated, I think indirectly between myself, Claire, and Sarah as students at Leeds, and I probably didn't realise that when Sarah had left that she came to Rochdale.
Yeah.
And I certainly hadn't any idea that she came to visit my final show. But it is interesting how Rochdale Art Gallery really embraced the fact that they were interested in working with artists and curators who were very much engaged with those kinds of critical issues and really cutting edge issues.
Yeah,
These
absolutely.
weren't the kinds of things
Sure.
that were happening in other exhibitions up and down the country, in the great metropolis, certainly. And I think that one of the things that Juliet Stein again talks about and addresses is that even from the perspective of feminist discourse, that up until then, although there were some really hugely important exhibitions that took place at the ICA, images, women's images of men, etc., that the kind of work that those exhibitions supported was predominantly made by white, middle and upper class women. So I think that what's fascinating about Rochdale Art Gallery is that it looked beyond that space and
Absolutely.
embraced something that was about a wider voice and a wider context for
Yeah.
discussion. It actually took on those issues in an
Yeah.
extraordinary way, I think.
Yeah, and that's probably an appropriate point to end. I would love this conversation to go on for much longer, but I think we're already probably slightly over our time.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for that.